So you're speaking about children. So we'll use children as our focus for today, as opposed to every other time where we don't focus on children, right? But I think Purim has this very strong child energy to it, and that's why I wanted to use Purim as an opportunity. But I want to do something completely different. So before we do that, if I had to tell you that there's something that we could learn from our children, particularly on Purim, what would come to your mind? In other words, what do you think we could learn from our kids? The truth is, what we're going to learn from our kids today is not going to be Purim specific, but the lesson is going to be from Purim. But let's just talk about Purim itself for a start. What can you learn from children besides the fact that they can change their minds 4,000 times before before settling on a Purim costume?
They're happy and enthusiastic.
Kids are happy, right?
Excitement of Purim.
The excitement. I don't know if there's a certain age at which you kind of feel that you've lost that excitement for Purim. You do Purim because you've got to do Purim, but you don't necessarily have that same excitement that the kids have. The kids, it's like, this build-up and the enthusiasm and the talking about it for ages in advance or whatever. It's a really big deal. So, excitement. Would it be fair to say that as adults, sometimes we feel that we've lost our excitement generally? Not only about Purim, it's like about life. In other words, kids live life with excitement. It's not only around Purim. They get excited about everything, right? I mean, I think about when I look at what we do here with the children's service and the kind of things that you offer kids as prizes. And they get so excited about this absolute junk. They get so excited about it. So definitely, I think that one of the great lessons from children is enthusiasm and energy. There's a great Jerry Seinfeld thing where he says, how is it that with kids, we're always telling them to sit down, calm down, like all the language is about pretty much down, in kids, they're always speaking with a language that's all about up, Can I stay up? Like that kind of thing. So it feels like sometimes we're just the Grinch, we're the dampeners of their excitement. Oh, just take it easy, and they have this incredible excitement. Okay, what else do you think we could learn from kids around Purim? Well, I think one thing, not that we could learn from kids, but that we have to acknowledge about kids, is their incredible capacity to store sugar in their systems. That should really, I think the amount of sugar that they can consume on Purim, or a birthday party for that matter, but Purim is just a birthday party on steroids, would probably kill a grown adult. The amount of they just keep going and going. So stamina, maybe that's one of the things we could learn from the kids, is stamina. Yeah. But I think generally when you talk about Purim, which is a holiday of happiness, and you think about children and happiness, one of the great lessons about children is that they're willing to allow happiness to override other things. So adults, for example, we get so caught up in things like proving a point or being right, and it comes at the cost of happiness. And kids would rather be happy. So they'll be very upset about the particular thing that you said they can and can't do, but then 5 minutes later, they'll be back into the swing of Purim. They're quite resilient in that way. They bounce back. So we can certainly learn from kids about choosing happiness. Now, I think that those are all the kinds of things that we would have probably thought. Just as soon as somebody says, what can you learn about children around Purim? I think that's what people would have thought. I'm going to take something completely different, completely unrelated, something we don't necessarily think about and perhaps don't give our children enough credit for. But in order to get to this particular point, I want to take the Purim story and look at something about the Purim story, about the observance rather, the observance of Purim, and an element of the Purim story that I don't think anybody ever talks about. So basically, what happens with Purim? You know why when people see Purim on a flyer for a shiur, you know why people say, I can probably skip this one? Because we all think we're going to hear the same thing every single time. So you're going to come to a Purim story. What are you going to hear at the Purim shiur? You're going to hear something about Esther and the tremendous dedication that she had on behalf of her people, and the fact that Achashverosh was paranoid schizophrenic, and that Mordechai was a great man. I mean, what are you going to hear already? And Hashem loves us, and He does miracles, and Yeah, like really, what are you going to hear at a Purim shir that you haven't heard before? Seriously, I think the average person will say, whatever they're going to say over there, I've heard it a million times. What could you possibly learn about Purim that you have never heard before? So we're going to look at two things that I really, really don't believe that you've heard before about Purim. I'm going to use those two things to put together a picture. That picture is going to tell us about one of the very powerful lessons of what Purim can teach us, and then we'll identify how our children really lead the charge in this particular way. Okay, so it's a fair amount of stuff that's going to build on each other. First thing I want to ask you is this. What date is Purim on the Hebrew calendar? Okay, we all know it's Adar, right? So what date? What date of Adar?
6th.
No?
14th.
14th, right? It's the 14th of Adar. Purim is the 14th of Adar. And if you're in Jerusalem, when is Purim?
13th.
The 15th of Adar, right? Jerusalem is the next day.
Don't they dress up yesterday?
No, that's because Israel has turned this into a national holiday now that goes on for many days. So they start to dress up already in advance. But the actual celebration of Purim is on the 14th of Adar. And if you're in Jerusalem, on the 15th of Adar. And if you want to go from, let's say, Tel Aviv to Jerusalem on Purim, you could do Purim twice. Okay? So, just, Now I want to ask you this. What happens if a person has personal circumstances, and because of those personal circumstances, they won't get to celebrate Purim? So let's use an example that's probably a relatable example. Let's say, God forbid, somebody finds out on today, the 13th of Adar, Erev Purim, somebody finds out, God forbid, they have to go through a very urgent surgery tomorrow. So they're not going to be able to hear the Megillah tomorrow. They have this major surgery. What do?
Shush.
So you'd think Shushan Purim, right? That's what you think. Shushan Purim. So the halacha is very interesting halacha. The halacha is that if a person has extenuating circumstances, by rights, they could read the Megillah on the 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, or 15th of Adar. So you get this range of dates. Interesting, right? People don't know that. Now, what do they say? Please do not try this at home. Because you got to get to shul. This is not it's inconvenient because you couldn't get a babysitter, so now you're going to hear Megillah the day before. This is a person who has absolutely extenuating circumstances. There's room, halachically, to facilitate that a person could also read the Megillah on those dates. Now, where do we know that from?
So once he hurt his back and he can't move, can he read the Megillah for himself?
He has to read the Megillah for himself.
Yeah, you don't need a minion or anything. Eh?
So it's an interesting question. By rights, the Shulchan Aruch says that you're supposed to have a minion for the Megillah, because the Megillah is considered like prayer. It's not considered like Torah study, so therefore it requires a minion. If a person doesn't have a minion, then they should read for themselves rather than somebody else read for them. Obviously, if they don't know how to read for themselves, then you get somebody else to read. Okay? All right. So, where does it come from that you can read the Megillah on these arbitrary dates? Like we get Shushan Purim. Makes sense. Part of the miracle, part of the story. Makes sense. Where does it come from? The 11th, 12th, 13th of Adar. Okay? So where does it come from? It comes from the Mishnah. So just to put it into context, every book of the Talmud is it's a composite of Mishnah and then the Gemara commenting on the Mishnah. Okay, so you have a tractate of the Talmud called Megillah. So no prizes for guessing what it talks about. Okay, so if you want to know anything about Purim, where are you going to find any of the information about Purim? It's going to be in the tractate Megillah. So the very first Mishnah, which is the opening conversation of the tractate of Megillah, is going to talk about what? Take a wild guess. What do you think it's going to talk about? When to read the Megillah. That's how it starts. The very first line of the very first Mishnah says as follows. Megillah Nikreis. The Megillah is read on the 11th, the 12th, the 13th, the 14th, or the 15th of Adar. That's what it says. Then the Mishnah explains how we get to those dates. So the Mishnah says as follows. The actual miracle of Purim happened on the 14th of Adar. So obviously that's when we celebrate Purim. And obviously if you're celebrating Purim, that's when you read the Megillah. But that's not how the Mishnah says it. The Mishnah says as follows. Krochin hamukafin choima mimois Yoshua bin Nun. Large cities that have a wall around them that dates back to the time of Joshua, they read the Megillah on the 15th of Adar. What we call Shushan Purim. Why is it called Shushan Purim? Anybody know how it got that name? Shushan Purim. Okay, so let's do a little bit of the history. So the history is that Achashverosh had an empire that stretched over 127 countries, from Ethiopia to India. and the capital city was called Shushan.
Oh, it took a day longer to defeat them.
Correct, exactly. So they defeated their enemies in the general populace on the 14th of Adar, and therefore that became Purim. And then they had a special additional dispensation to be able to fight against the enemies in the capital city on Shushan, and that occurred on the next day on the 15th, so therefore the 15th became Shushan Purim. Okay? Now, what's that got to do with walls? It should be that you celebrate Purim on the 14th unless you're in Shushan. So when they instituted Purim, straight after the Purim story, and we're going to talk about that, that's going to be the second thing we're going to talk about, is how Purim became a holiday. If you grew up with Herman Charles Bosman, so you might remember those books, like how the elephant got a long nose and how those things. So Lahavdil, this is like how Purim became a holiday. How did it become a holiday? What do you think? You just vote, and then they decide it's not so simple how to become a holiday. So we've got to explore that. However, before we get to that, so how did Shushan become the holiday of the walled cities? Because when the men of the Great Assembly, the Anshe Knesset HaGadola, which was basically like a Sanhedrin in exile, when they decided that they were going to make a holiday called Purim, they knew that there's going to be a special date celebrated only in Shushan. In those days, Shushan had a Jewish population. And they felt that that was disrespectful to Jerusalem. How could it be that the capital of the Persian Empire has its own Yontiv, and the capital of the Jewish Empire doesn't have its own Yontiv? It wasn't appropriate. So therefore they decided that any city that has a wall that dates back to the time of Joshua, which obviously would include Jerusalem, those would be included in the Shushan Purim unique celebration. Okay, so for example, if you were in Jericho, Jericho obviously had walls until Joshua came along, and then there were no further walls. Okay, so we understand that there's the 15th of Adar is now for those cities with the walls. Then we've got regular cities. They have their Purim on the 14th of Adar. That's everyone. That's us. And then the Mishnah says as follows. What happens if you lived in a shtetl? What happens if you lived in a little dorpy? We don't have that so much in this country, but we used to. We used to have the one Jew who lived in Leidenberg, and like the three Jews who lived in Warden, and like that's how it used to be. You used to have these Jews. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't exist anymore. So back in those days, there were also people who used to live in these little villages, and the villages did not have shuls. Didn't have shuls. And that was literally the case. It's probably the case still in many places in the world. But that was literally the case in this country up until probably the turn of the millennium, in the early 2000s, probably when it changed. You speak to people, people over here in the community. Say we used to live in Echveis and Mayatan, we used to go to shul in Vereniging. So it wasn't a shul in our town. That's how it was. So it was that way too in those days. Hundreds and thousands of years ago, there were these little villages that didn't have a shul. So they didn't have anybody who could read the Megillah. What they did have is they had a big market day every Monday and every Thursday where all the villagers from a certain area would all come together in wherever the market was, and they would all trade and do whatever they did. And then they had enough people that they could have a minyan and they could do whatever they had to do. So the Mishnah says those people live in the Kfarim, in the little villages, so they would read the Megillah before Purim on whichever date would be the closest market day. So now Purim, let's say, is on a Sunday. You can't obviously have a market day on Shabbos. They didn't have a market day on a Friday, so the closest market day would be Thursday. That's the earliest time that they would ever land up reading the Megillah, the 11th of Adar. If Purim, let's say, was on a Monday, they'd be reading on the same day. If Purim was on a Tuesday, they'd be one day earlier. They'd be reading on the 13th. If Purim was on a Wednesday, they'd be 2 days earlier. They'd be reading on the 12th. So that's how it lands up, that you have the 11th, the 12th, the 13th as the, so to speak, reserved dates to read the Megillah, and the 14th and the 15th, which are the main dates to read the Megillah. Okay? So that's basically, I know it's a little bit technical, but that's basically how it works. Okay. So now I'm going to ask you a technical question. And I apologize in advance if there's too much technical stuff over here and everybody wants tachlis. Just tell me how to get my child to behave and not to overdose on sugar. But let's just look at another technical issue. The other technical issue is this. If you were writing a book of Jewish law, and you now came to the section where you're writing the laws of Purim, what would you begin with? So the first law that you're going to tell everybody is when they have to read the Megillah. So if you were writing this book, and there are three options as to where you read the Megillah. Either you read the Megillah in a walled city on the 15th, or you read the Megillah in a regular city on the 14th, or you're one of the outliers who live in one of these little shtetl, then you have to have either the 11th or the 12th or the 13th. How would you write that in your little book of Jewish law? How would you write it? What would you start with?
Then it must be on the 14th.
The 14th, right? Why? Because that's the most common. Don't you think that's logical? You first start with the most common scenario, and then you branch out into the less common scenarios. Don't you think it makes sense? Mm-hmm. What does the Mishnah do? The exact opposite. The Mishnah says, you read the Megillah on the 11th, the 12th, the 13th, then the 14th and the 15th. So why do you think he did that?
Give it leeway.
What do you mean leeway?
Like maybe just extra few days.
But either way, you're going to give the leeway. But don't you think it makes more sense first to say this is when you must do it, and then you can talk about when you can do it? So why do you think he did it that way? There's no sequential thinkers here. Don't you think it makes sense to start from 11? Doesn't it make sense? You start at the beginning. You say 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. It's not hard. The only thing is, if you like a sequence, do the sequence in reverse. Start with the 15th, which is an obligatory time to read the Megillah. Then the 14th, which is an obligatory time to read the Megillah. Then go 12, 13, 11 as the leeway, like you said, right? And if you don't make those, then you get these. Especially when you consider that the next part of the Mishnah, that's actually how he does it. When he explains why there's a difference, he starts from the 15th, then he goes to the 14th, and then he speaks about the others. So the question is, why does he start with the 11th? Okay, interesting question, and we're going to put that question on hold, park that question, and hopefully now move away from the technical stuff and ask ourselves a different question. Okay? How did Purim become a holiday? And the reason that that's a good question to ask is because you could then say, what if something very happy happens to the Jewish people now? Do we make a holiday? How do you make a Jewish holiday? How do you decide? Like, we understand how Pesach became Pesach because Hashem said there's going to be Pesach. He took us out of Egypt and he said, every single year you're going to celebrate this as Pesach. So that's how it became Pesach. But how did Purim become Purim? There was no voice out of the heavens that said, thou shalt observe Purim on the 14th. It's not written in the Torah. The Torah was completed already years before. So how did Purim become a holiday? Interesting question, right? So you want to hear how Purim became a holiday? There was an activist. And the activist lobbied for Purim to become a holiday. In other words, this particular activist lobbied the rabbis who had the say as to whether it's going to become a holiday or not, what was called the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. That was the body, the authoritative body that could decide it was going to become a holiday. So this activist went to these people and said, make a holiday out of it. And part of the lobby was not only make a holiday out of it, but we're going to write down the story, and we'd like you to include the story as one of the books of the Torah, one of the books of the Tanakh. So who was the activist? Esther. Esther was the activist. Esther was the activist. And Esther is the one, can you imagine? She says, this is my story, I'm going to fight for it. It's got to have its place in the annals of Jewish history. So she approaches the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, the men of the Great Assembly, and she says, I want two things. Number one, I want the Megillah that I've written, because if you have a look, the third last line in the Megillah tells us that she wrote the Megillah. She says, I want the Megillah that I've written to be included in the Tanakh, number one. And number two, I want this to be an annual holiday that we commemorate with a whole lot of different rules. You've got to listen to the Megillah and give gifts to your friends, etc., etc. So how do you think it went down? Try and picture the scene. Imagine you were fly on the wall in the halls of the supreme Jewish legal authority at the time, the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, and there's this woman knocking on the door saying, I want you to include my holiday. How do you think it went down?
Not good.
Well, like any other Jewish conversation. It was a massive debate. Massive debate. There was a group that said, listen, it's a huge miracle. This was a threat of genocide against the entire Jewish community. We've never had anything like that. And to be honest, subsequently, neither. We've had the genocide without the miracle. But, we've never had the miracle without the genocide. So this is an unprecedented miracle where every single Jew alive at the time was under threat, and everybody was saved in one fell swoop, and our enemies were destroyed. It's like a massive miracle. So one school of thought says, obviously, we have to commemorate. We have to make this into a holiday. And the other school of thought says, what are you talking about? We no longer are in Israel. Since when is there a holiday, since the Jews left Egypt, to celebrate something that happened outside of Israel? We have no precedent for such a thing. Not only are we not in Israel, it's not like we left Israel because we decided to go open up a franchise in another part of the world. We left Israel in chains. We're in exile. The reason we're here is against our will. How can you turn this into a holiday? So there was a huge debate. And there was a similar debate about the Megillah. The debate around the Megillah was, who decides that you can now add extra books to the Tanakh? The Tanakh is books of prophecy. Prophecy is something which is reserved in Israel. You know, how do you add something in now? Even though there were other books that were added at around about the same time. But there was a huge controversy. What was one of the biggest controversies? How can you have a book that will become one of the books of the Jewish Bible and it does not have Hashem's name? How can you even do that? Right? Have you ever heard of something so absurd? You're going to make a book that is part of the Tanakh and it does not have Hashem's name. Doesn't make any sense. So the pushback was, well, we can't put Hashem's name in because, again, if you look in the Megillah, it tells us, because this was an event that involved the queen at the time, it was also then included in their history books, right? The Persian history books. And there was a fear that Mordechai had that when the Persians get hold of the story, every time it says Hashem, they'll replace that with the name of their pagan god. So out of respect to Hashem, let's leave Hashem's name out. It's actually better not to have Hashem's name in the Megillah. That way we'll protect Hashem from being, translated in their books into something else. But can you see, there was a lot of controversy. It wasn't a straightforward business. So now here we come to the crux of the conversation. So if there's a holiday that effectively got pushed through on a, we don't know what percentage majority, because it was a debate, so could have, if all you know, it could have been a simple majority. Maybe there was a 51% in favor of Purim. I don't know the final count. I don't think we have a record of, what was the final number of who was in favor of Purim. But one thing is for sure, it was not unanimous that Purim should become a holiday. Number two, it is at best a rabbinic holiday. That's the big thing that people like about Purim. You can still drive, you can still turn on the light, it gives you a phone. It's a rabbinic holiday, it doesn't have all of those restrictions. And number three, the main document that relates to the holiday does not have Hashem's name in it. So how high do you think it rates on the scale of holidays, of Jewish holidays? Like if you had to put Pesach, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Purim, how high do you think it rates? Not as high, right? Doesn't sound like it.
I know it's very high because I've heard you say before, I just can't remember why. You would think not.
Okay, so that's the question was, right, how high do you think? So you would think that it really doesn't rate. Because it's rabbinic to start with. That's already surely a couple of points down in the hierarchy. And then it came through debate, like they had to accept it rather than everybody saying, we need to make a holiday. And the document doesn't contain Hashem's name, so the impression that you get is that Purim doesn't really rate as highly as the other Yom Tovs. And if you want to put that into different words, you could say Purim doesn't sound as sophisticated as the other holidays. If you have a holiday that is from Hashem himself, that's a very high level experience. You look at Purim versus Pesach, that's why everybody stresses. The day Purim is over, everybody stresses. Why? Because to prepare for Purim, what do you have to do? You pack a little bit of food, and then on the day you give it to your friends, you fight with your kids about the fact that they can't dress up as who knows what. And had a kid at shul this week who came over to me and he asked me, what's better? To dress up as a terrorist or to dress up as a girl? He says, in today's world, there's a kid. It says, in today's world, what's better? I should dress up like a terrorist or dress up like a girl? The questions that you have to answer. We'll leave that for when it's not being recorded, right? So the thing is that, how hard is it? Purim is Pesach is a much more sophisticated holiday. You've got to know all these laws, and you've got to prepare, and you've got to clean this, and you've got to boil that, and what you can use and what you can't use, and how much matzah you have to eat, and how big it has to be, and how quickly you have to eat it, and what time you have to finish eating. It's a much more sophisticated holiday. It's like sounds like real Judaism, It's hard. It sounds like real Judaism. Purim sounds a bit too easy for Judaism. What do? You hear the Megillah, have some fun, have a l'chaim. It doesn't sound so hard. So if you had a rate in terms of spiritual power, spiritual hierarchy and halachic sophistication, Purim really seems like the simple holiday. It's not the simple holiday, it's the child holiday. The others are adult holidays. Now, Pesach's an adult holiday. Rosh Hashanah is for sure an adult holiday. Yom Kippur, the most adult holiday. Because you've got to be so mature about it, Accept the fact that you've got to sit in shul for hours, even though you don't really appreciate it, and you've got to wear shoes that are, nowadays, non-leather shoes are not a big challenge, right? You can't put on deodorant, you can't eat. You've got to be a real adult to handle Yom Kippur. In fact, we know that there's absolutely no reason for children, for example, to fast, whereas on Purim, we dafka, like children are the centerpiece. So it feels like Purim is the child holiday, and the other yontos are the adult holidays. So that's where we're going to start to get a clue what Purim tells us about our children and what we could learn from our children, because Purim is more child holiday. So here's the first irony of the story. First irony is the Rambam tells us, and I say specifically the Rambam for two reasons. Number one, because the Rambam speaks like a rationalist rather than some kind of idealist or mystic. Number two, because the Rambam writes this in his Mishnah Torah, which is a book of Jewish law, as opposed to, like, for example, his Moreh HaNevuchim, which is a book of philosophy. So if you put something into a legal context, you're saying that you really mean it. So the Rambam writes as follows. All Yom Tovs will cease when Mashiach comes. So now everybody's going to daven really hard for Mashiach to come before Pesach. That's what he says. All Yom Tovs will cease when Mashiach comes, except Purim. So now that's a bit of a surprise, right? Because now you've got a day that looked like it was a lot less of a spiritual impact than the other Yom Tovs, and suddenly you see, but it must have some kind of a spiritual impact. It must have a huge impact because it can outlast the other Yom Tovs. Let's look at this from a different perspective. Why do you think Mashiach's going to come and suddenly there's going to be a whole bunch of Yom Tovs that disappear? What do you think? Okay, guys, you did so well. You fasted so many Yom Kippurs, now you're off the hook. That's not how it works. It's because every Yom Tov is a channel for a particular energy from Hashem that enters this world. When Mashiach comes, the energy that will be available on a consistent basis will be greater than the energy of a Yom Tov today. So we won't need the Yom Tov. That's the point. It's not that Hashem says, okay, Yom Tov is now expired. You won't need the Yom Tov to achieve that great spiritual experience, because you'll experience something greater than that on a daily basis. So therefore, the fact that Purim will survive the Messianic revelation, that means that the access to godly revelation that Purim affords us must be higher and greater than all the other Yom Tovs. Now that's a paradox. I didn't see that coming. Because we all think Purim is, I hate to say it, but people do say it, so that's why I'm using the expression. There are a lot of people who think Purim is like the Jewish Halloween. You go the opposite of trick-or-treating. Instead of getting sweets, you're giving sweets. And you dress up. That's what people think. And people think it's like, there are many people out there who think that Purim is a holiday for children. Even last week, I had somebody tell me, please don't expect me on Purim. It's for kids. Not for me. I'm a mature adult, successful person. Whatever. I don't come over here and start making noise when Haman's name. It's not for me. If you think about it, Purim even gets adults to do childish things. The Shulchan Aruch asks the question whether or not you should make a noise when Haman's name is mentioned. Right? It's interesting. So some of the commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch bring examples of some of the great rabbis, how they would dafka make a noise when Haman's name was mentioned, so that you should recognize that it's an acceptable practice. Because what we think is for the kids. The kids the kids must behave like kids. But actually on Purim, we're challenged to behave like kids. You ever watched how a person behaves when they put on a mask? Doesn't matter who they are, they become a child. It's a fascinating thing. So it's this paradoxical holiday, because on the one hand it's a child holiday, and on the other hand suddenly we're seeing, but it actually has power that is beyond what the other Yom Tovs have, so it's going to survive into the intensity of Mashiach and not be overwhelmed by or eclipsed by Mashiach. That's fascinating. So we've got to understand why. What is it about Purim that makes it so powerful? And by extension, what is it about children that make them so powerful? What is it about a child that gives us so much nachas? I'm not talking about the other stuff they give us, but at the times that they give us nachas, which hopefully is more, than the other stuff. What is it about a child that makes them so amazing to us, and that we should learn from? So let's go back to the dates. But I'm not going to focus on the dates. I'm going to focus on the 3 different scenarios. There's a walled city, there's a regular city, and then there's a village. And what we're going to discover is that these 3 geographical settings or demographical settings, they represent 3 different spiritual states that a person could be in. So some people live in a spiritual state of being in a walled city, some people in a regular city, and some people live in a village. Okay? So let's think, in those days, what was the significance of a walled city? You don't have to be too creative for this. It's contained and
Protection.
secure. A walled city is a secure environment. You know, when you go to Jerusalem and you walk in through the gate, like for example, you walk in the Jaffa gate, you realize how thick those walls were. You know, how they're proper fortifications. People don't realize this, but at the time of the destruction of the Second Temple by the Romans, the last stronghold of military power was the Beis Hamikdash itself, because the structure of the Beis Hamikdash, in addition to the fact that it was a place for godliness, it was designed to be a fortress. So a walled city implies security. Security means that you can't be affected by the enemy who lurks outside. So let's translate that into spirituality. If a person is in a spiritually walled city, what does that tell us about who they are or where they are in their spiritual development? Got a name for such a person? I'll give you a name for such a person. We call them a tzaddik. They've got such good defenses against any kind of inappropriate toxic thinking or behavior that they feel protected. In other words, a tzaddik would be somebody who is in a highly, highly sophisticated state of spirituality. And because they're at such an advanced level of spirituality, they don't have to worry about temptation, laziness, dishonesty. They don't have to worry about these things. It just never gets into their space. Interestingly, in the setup of the Megillah, the people who live in the walled cities, they read the Megillah on the 15th of the month. 15 is represented by the letters Yud and Hey, which are the first 2 letters of Hashem's name, meaning the highest dimension of Hashem's name. So if you're at that level, now we're putting aside the actual halachic practicalities of it, but if you're at that level that you can read, that you're in this protected spiritual environment, that means you're connected to the highest dimension of Hashem's name. So how many of us could claim this? Oh, we're at that level. We're at this very advanced, deep, powerful spiritual level. How many of us could claim this? Probably none of us. So then, if you're at this very high developed level of relationship with Hashem, your relationship with Hashem is not only strong, but it's deep. What does deep mean? It means that you have a real intellectual appreciation of how great Hashem is, and therefore you have a real deep appreciation, intellectual appreciation of the value of your Judaism. Now, we probably have some level of appreciation intellectually. There's certain things in Judaism we've learnt about and we appreciate, but to have that profound awareness of the power of God and the power of Judaism, most of us don't have it. And this is not a matter of if you went to a Jewish school, you didn't go to a Jewish school. This is a far, far more advanced level of appreciation. This is somebody who spends hours and hours on end contemplating on Hashem's greatness. This is a person who has an encyclopedic knowledge of Torah. That's somebody who can be in a walled city. So very quickly we realize the walled city is reserved for a very unique and limited group of Jewish people, which, by the way, is the practice of Purim as well. There are very few places on earth where you read the Megillah on the 15th. So that reflects the spiritual reality. The physical reality reflects the spiritual reality. There are very few places on earth where you read the Megillah on the 15th. In the same way as there are very few people who are in that spiritual state of this incredible connection to Hashem. So what's the next level down? The next level is the person who's living in the city. Now city life is also more sophisticated than rural life, right? So even if you're not living in a fully protected city, you still have the amenities of living in the city. You've got the minyan, you've got, I don't know, I was going to say electricity and running water, but that's not guaranteed living in a city, at least not in this part of the world. So, you've got, what have you got? You've got probably marketplaces. I'm saying in those days, before we had the Industrial Revolution. What did you have in the city? You had markets, you had essentials, you had water carriers, you didn't have to step your own water, you had wagon drivers, you had craftsmen, tradesmen, that's what you had in the city. So it's a much more developed reality. And so if you're a person who lives in a city, that implies spiritually, it's a person who has spiritual maturity. So maybe they don't have that depth of knowledge that the person living in the walled city has, but at least you have a deep sentiment for your Judaism. Why are you doing Jewish things? Because you love your Judaism, you appreciate your Judaism, because you're in awe of Hashem. So you've got this deep sentimental experience of Judaism. That's the representation of a person who's living in the city. And somebody who lives in a village doesn't have any of that. Realistically, in those days, the villager typically was illiterate. That was the typical scenario of the villager. Not only that, the villager would come into town, on the odd occasion that they came into town, they'd come into town and they'd be like all googly-eyed at things that everybody else takes for granted. Oh wow, look at that! They've got a water pump in the town square. You don't have to go to the river. And they would think that that's the most incredible thing. So in other words, the villager is a simple person. And the simple person doesn't yet have knowledge, and the simple person doesn't yet have a mature emotional connection with their Judaism. So the simple person, why do they do Jewish things? They don't do it because they understand and appreciate it like the guy in the walled city. And they don't even do it because they have this deep, powerful, mature emotional connection like the person who's in the city. So why do they do what they do? Why? Because they know they have to. They don't question. They don't need a whole explanation before they get on board. Us sophisticated adults, you've got to explain it to us, motivate, tell me why I've got to do this. I have to appreciate it. If I don't appreciate it, I'm not going to do it. The villager, if that's what you do, that's what you do. They have a simplicity to them. And because of that simplicity, they're able to accept what they're told without getting tied in knots, because they've got their own agendas and their preconceptions and the things that offend them. You know how it is in today's world. How can I offend you today? So the villager doesn't have that issue. So if you're living in the walled city, you look at the villager and say, nah, villager, illiterate, unsophisticated. Even if you live in the city, you look at the villager and say, country bumpkin, The question is, how does Hashem look at the villager? How do you think Hashem looks at the villager? Let's see if we could use the Mishnah to rationalize how Hashem looks at the villager.
Gives their dates first.
He gives their dates first. And he gives them more dates. Isn't that fascinating? You are this amazing person who's living in Jerusalem, not Jerusalem in geography, but Jerusalem in spirit. You get one day. You get one day. And you know what? Your day is going to be the last one we talk about. You're living in a general city. That means to say you've got a developed state of understanding or appreciation, or at least a mature relationship with your Judaism. Fine. You get one day. But the guy who lives in the village, that everybody else is so quick to dismiss because you don't understand, you're a simpleton, gets mentioned first and gets 3 days. 3 potential days. Not you obviously get 1 out of the 3, but you get a range. Why is that? Because there's a power to simplicity that sophistication can never achieve. When a person is so developed and so sophisticated in whatever it is that they've done in our context, in their relationship with Hashem or their relationship with their Judaism, the sophistication means that at any given time, I could get too sophisticated for my own good. Meaning to say, I could start thinking that I have certain questions, issues that need to be resolved, or I could require things to be in a very specific way before I can actually engage with them. Like we said earlier, What's one of the things we could learn from children? How to be happy. The reason we're not happy as easily as kids is we're too sophisticated. How can I be happy if this doesn't work and that doesn't? We've got the whole thing. This person hasn't apologized. How can I be happy? This thing hasn't sorted out. How can I be happy? Because we're so sophisticated, we've got this whole list of things that all have to come together in order for us to have positivity, enthusiasm, excitement, optimism. Child has a simplicity. Simplicity is, if today is a day to be happy, let's be happy. We don't have to overanalyze it. We don't have to overlook, right? So Purim is the child holiday, not because we needed something to entertain the kids, because all the other holidays are so, sophisticated. It's because there's a power to being a child. There's a power to simplicity. There's a power to, you tell a child something and they accept it. I'm not talking about teenagers. You tell a child, this is what we do, that's it. They accept it. They don't have to overcomplicate things. We live in our heads worrying about the things that maybe my child will feel this way, say that, ask this, whatever the case is. So which is the holiday that endures into the age of Mashiach? The holiday of the simplicity of a child. That's why we have such a hard time with Purim, because it forces us to behave in an unsophisticated way. If you want me to make noise and shul, that's for kids. You want me to go ad de lo yada? Yes, I'm not suggesting that a person has become a drunkard, because kids also don't do that, by the way. It says on Purim you're supposed to reach a point you don't know the difference between Haman and Mordechai. That doesn't mean you become a drunk who doesn't know the difference between anything. It means you get to a point, it doesn't make a difference if it's Haman or Mordechai who's a good guy. It doesn't make a difference. I don't need it all to work out for me. I don't need it all to make sense to me. If this is a day to be happy, I'll be happy. I'll find the happiness inside of myself. That's the challenge of Purim, to become like a child. The child doesn't wait for every single thing to align. The child will even have their tantrum and still be happy. That's the deeper meaning of not knowing the difference between blessing Mordechai and cursing Haman. Not that I've lost my mind, I've lost my need. I've lost my need for the Mordechai to be blessed before I could be happy. So it's a very profound holiday, it turns out, Purim. And not only is it a profound holiday in isolation, but it's a holiday that reminds us that every single day of our lives we have these people in our lives who keep living this way to teach us that we can also take a page out of their book. We could also have a little bit of that simplicity. And just one last little point to this, and that's why the Megillah doesn't have Hashem's name in it. Because the minute there's a name of Hashem, our overcomplicated, sophisticated mind starts to say, oh, this is this name of Hashem, which represents that kind of energy, which means Hashem is in that kind of so-called mood, as we sometimes do, right? Here it's Yud Kei Vav Kei, there it's Elokim. What does it imply? Here we're talking, there's no names. We're talking about Hashem in the plainest but most essential terms. Because the way you really, really connect with Hashem is you get past all that so-called faux sophistication. And that's a really challenging on the one hand and powerful on the other hand headspace to get ourselves into. So perhaps we don't succeed on a daily basis to learn that simple acceptance from our children or simple happiness from our children. And maybe we're not even expected to get it right every single day, although that would be ideal. But we certainly are expected to try and have some of that over the course of Purim, because that then not only fulfills what the holiday is about, but it opens the channels for the brachas and miracles that Purim contains in it, that sometimes we're so sophisticated we don't know how to unlock. You just need a child, to come with their little hammer kind of thing and break the lock and open up Purim for us. So there's a tremendous amount, right? It's a tremendous amount that we can learn from our children, not just simply because they're naive, but rather because simplicity has a value.